Journalists believed they had their story firmly established until Karoline and Trump revealed their contradictions so completely that they were left speechless. The space was filled to capacity. Reporters, videographers, political commentators all around. Gazes were fixed on the stage. Microphones aimed ahead like tools of scrutiny. Pens held firmly, poised for the slightest misstep. This was no ordinary press conference. The moment had arrived for the press conference. Karoline Leavitt stood confidently beside Donald Trump at the front of the room. Her hands poised on the podium. Her expression composed yet incisive. She had experienced this previously. She understood precisely how these matters functioned. A subtle change in stance, a fleeting look at an inopportune time, and the press would contort it into something entirely different. Yet today that opportunity would elude them. Trump made a slight adjustment to the microphone. He spoke without the need to clear his throat or pause. As he leaned in, an eerie hush enveloped the room. Silence envelopes the room, a palpable tension hanging in the air, as if the very walls are holding their breath in expectation. He surveyed the throng with an expression that blended amusement and defiance. He understood the intricacies of the game more than anyone else. "Very well," Trump declared, his voice resonating throughout the entire room. "I trust that you all have some thoughtful and impartial inquiries. Correct?" A gentle wave of laughter swept across the audience. A few journalists adjusted their positions in their chairs. Some exchanged knowing glances, plotting their next moves. Karoline cast a fleeting look at the front row. The familiar faces were present. CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post. She could perceive it in their gaze. They had no interest in the truth. They arrived with the intent to provoke, to manipulate, to transform every statement into a sensational headline crafted to incite anger instead of providing clarity. Yet that was perfectly acceptable. Today, the narrative was beyond their control. Trump pressed on. "There's much to discuss. Border security, the state of the economy, the complete turmoil unfolding under this administration. Let's begin with whatever intriguing material you all have lined up for today." That was all it required. Hands sprang into the air. Journalists leaned in. The atmosphere transformed from a taut stillness to a managed frenzy. A woman seated in the front row was the first to speak. Her voice was crisp and polished, the sort that has been honed to seize attention on screen. "Mr. Trump, as the election approaches, numerous Americans express concerns that your policies pose a threat to democratic values. What is your approach to addressing those concerns?" Karoline remained composed, yet the sensation lingered within her. The arrangement. Trump inclined his head, pretending to be intrigued. "Which individuals from the United States? Those who are witnessing inflation squeeze their finances? Those observing their urban landscapes transform into areas plagued by crime? Which ones are you referring to?" The woman hesitated before responding. The question caught her off guard, reflecting back on her unexpectedly. She bounced back swiftly, however. "The worry is that your language creates division and erodes trust in our institutions." Karoline finally articulated her thoughts, her tone unwavering and composed. "It seems you're suggesting that individuals are weary of deception, exhausted by the constant dismissal of their struggles, exhausted from being manipulated into thinking that circumstances are improving when every indication suggests the opposite." The atmosphere in the room changed. A handful of reporters shared knowing looks. The lenses focused intently. Yet Karoline had more to say. "They don't harbor skepticism towards institutions due to mere rhetoric. They have a deep-seated skepticism towards them, having witnessed the consequences when those institutions cease to serve their interests." A moment of quietude. Only one. Suddenly, before the reporter had a chance to respond, a different voice intruded. More forceful, more piercing, and undeniably confrontational. And just like that, the true assault commenced. As soon as Karoline completed her words, the atmosphere in the room grew more charged. The journalists were aware of the recent events that had unfolded. She seized the reins of the dialogue before they could shape it to their liking. And that was bound to create some tension. A gentleman in the second row, adorned with thick glasses and a tailored suit, interjected. His voice exuded a self-satisfied confidence, as if he believed he had devised an impeccable scheme. Ms. Leavitt, are you suggesting that the media should refrain from scrutinizing those in power? Should journalists simply accept everything politicians say? A timeless maneuver. Portray it as if she were launching an assault on the very foundation of free journalism. Karoline tilted her head ever so slightly, a subtle smile dancing at the edges of her lips. No, she said, her tone steady. I'm suggesting that journalists ought to fulfill their responsibilities. A handful of journalists fidgeted, as though the statements had struck with more weight than they had anticipated. Trump let out a chuckle. Absolutely, you ought to jot that down. The man in glasses advanced, determined not to let the opportunity fade into the background. Do you really think the media stands against the interests of the public? There it stood, the headline they desired. Karoline could nearly sense it taking shape in their minds. Trump and Leavitt intensify their assaults on journalists, branding them as enemies of the people. She remained unblinking. She expressed the belief that it is essential for the media to ensure that those in power are held accountable. However, I believe that when reporters cease to pose genuine inquiries and begin to fabricate narratives, they lose their essence as journalists. They are advocates equipped with press credentials. That particular strike. A whisper spread among the gathering. A handful of cameras focused intently, searching for the slightest hint of uncertainty on her expression. Certain doubts they could amplify and dissect. No evidence was discovered. The man wearing glasses had more to say. Are you really suggesting that conservative media is free from misinformation? Have outlets like Fox News truly never misled the public? Karoline stood firm. When a major news outlet dedicates 4 years to promoting a narrative of collusion, only to later retract it without facing any consequences, it raises serious questions about the integrity of their reporting. When major media outlets suppress the Hunter Biden laptop story prior to an election and only acknowledge its authenticity once it loses significance, that cannot be considered true journalism. That constitutes interference in the electoral process. A moment of stillness. Suddenly, another voice interrupted. This one had a more pointed edge, infused with irritation. Mr. Trump, a woman in a striking red blazer, inquired, do you think you'll accept the results of the 2024 election no matter the outcome? It was a familiar inquiry, one they had posed to him countless times before, and they anticipated his response would mirror the past, bold, audacious, and dismissive. Yet Trump was familiar with this play. He approached the microphone, his voice unwavering. He stated that he would accept a fair election. So, after a moment, will you? The woman stood still, her body rigid. It was understated, yet Karoline noticed it. The fleeting glimmer of uncertainty in the reporter's face, suggesting she was caught off guard by that reply. For she was aware. She recognized that the same journalists insisting Trump acknowledge any outcome had devoted 4 years to labeling his 2016 triumph as illegitimate. They had elevated conspiracy theories regarding stolen votes, Russian interference, and flawed systems until it ceased to benefit them. The stillness lingered, heavy with things left unsaid. However, another journalist, picking up on the change, interjected. To clarify, are you suggesting that the election can only be considered fair if you emerge victorious? A snare adorned with just the right amount of allure to appear harmless. Trump remained unfazed. It is essential for Americans to be assured that the election process is just and transparent, without question. Isn't that what genuine reporters should aspire to? The room hung in silence for a moment. Suddenly, as if summoned, a voice, sharper and more forceful, pierced the atmosphere. And just like that, the press conference became a fierce arena. The tension had reached its boiling point. It reached a vigorous boil. Journalists had moved beyond merely posing inquiries. They exchanged blows, each one hoping to make a connection. A youthful reporter in the front row, just past his 20s, leaned in, clutching his notepad as if it were a protective barrier. His voice oozed with superiority. Ms. Leavitt, your focus on media bias seems to be a way of sidestepping the real issue, doesn't it? If conditions were truly as favorable during Trump's tenure as you suggest, wouldn't the evidence be clear and undeniable? It was polished, crafted to give the impression that she was sidestepping genuine concerns. Karoline refrained from taking the bait. She pivoted to confront him head-on. The evidence certainly has a way of revealing the truth, she remarked. It seems you have a strong aversion to their words. The atmosphere in the room transformed. The inexperienced journalist blinked, taken by surprise. Karoline pressed on. Let's discuss the facts. During President Trump's tenure, unemployment reached unprecedented lows. Wages increased. Energy independence was attainable. That isn't a matter of opinion. It's a matter of data. However, you and your team dedicated years to persuading the American public that their own perceptions were deceiving them. She advanced slightly, allowing the gravity of her words to linger in the air. Currently, families are facing the pressures of rising inflation, while crime rates are escalating in major urban areas, and the situation at the border is spiraling beyond management. Are you interested in discussing facts? Those are undeniable truths. Instead of engaging with the current administration on meaningful issues, you're focused on playing to the crowd. The young reporter prepared to respond, but Karoline continued unabated. You don't want facts, she stated, her tone steady. You seek concise phrases. You seek a phrase that you can shape and mold into a captivating headline that aligns with your story. A handful of breaths escaped from the audience. A pair of journalists shared fleeting looks, their fingers poised above the keys, contemplating the angle they would take on this story. Yet Karoline remained unfazed. She glanced at another reporter, someone who had been poised for a chance to speak. Go ahead, she urged, motioning toward the microphone. What comes next? A woman sporting a press badge from a prominent network adjusted her earpiece with a focused demeanor. Her question carried weight even before it left her lips. Ms. Leavitt, are you suggesting that journalists ought not to question politicians? Should the media really just take everything Trump says at face value? Karoline's smile was present, yet it lacked any genuine warmth. I'm asserting that reporters ought to hold every politician accountable, not merely those they disagree with. The ensuing silence was palpable, almost tangible in its weight. Trump, observing from her side, smiled broadly. He inclined his head closer to the microphone. You know, he said, I recall a time when the media held those in power accountable. However, if a member of the Democratic Party claims the sky is green, it seems to be reported as if it were an undeniable truth. And if we declare it blue, you label it as misinformation. A hesitant chuckle echoed among the audience, yet none were bold enough to confront the issue directly. Karoline crossed her arms. She remarked that you seem unfazed by the dishonesty of politicians. There's an issue with politicians who elude your influence. The young journalist adjusted his position, visibly uneasy at that moment. The woman with the earpiece cast her eyes over her notes, contemplating her next step. Yet, just as they began to regain their composure, a different voice interjected, piercing and commanding. In an instant, the media found themselves on the back foot. The atmosphere had shifted in a noticeable way. The media arrived equipped, poised to shape the narrative. Yet, in an unexpected turn, they found themselves on the defensive. Karoline stood firm, revealing the selective indignation, the meticulously constructed stories, and the subtle animosity disguised as reporting. What about Trump? He savored every moment of it. He positioned the microphone, cast a quick look at Karoline, then faced the reporters again, a subtle shake of his head accompanying his expression. You never learn, he remarked, a blend of amusement and disbelief coloring his tone. A tall man with gray hair, known for his sharp and probing inquiries, stepped forward to take the lead. Mr. Trump, you continue to hold the media accountable. Isn't it reasonable to suggest that you gain from controversy? You flourish in separation. Your supporters are still observing this, savoring every moment. Doesn't that place you in a position of equal responsibility for the alleged media distrust as the journalists you critique? Trump inclined his head, as though pondering the thought. Yet, the moment he leaned closer to the microphone, the atmosphere transformed once more. He stated it clearly. Silence enveloped the room. The media's lack of trust isn't my doing. It is viewed with skepticism due to your ongoing, habitual dishonesty. And when you find yourself in a bind, you simply carry on as if it never occurred. He paused for a moment before proceeding. You dedicated years to promoting the Russia hoax. You claimed that the Hunter Biden laptop was a product of Russian disinformation. You referred to inflation as temporary. You supported restrictions that devastated local enterprises while the privileged celebrated behind closed doors. You dismissed Americans as irrational for their worries about the border until the figures grew too significant to overlook. The man interjected, attempting to assert his dominance once more. So you're suggesting that Trump raised a hand, interrupting him. No, don't attempt that, he remarked. I understand your intentions. You'll extract a single sentence, remove it from its original context, attach a catchy headline, and act as if it conveys an entirely different meaning. Isn't that the game? Several journalists glanced at their notes with a critical eye. People steered clear of his gaze entirely. They understood precisely what he meant. Trump reclined a bit. Let me reveal the true situation. People in the United States have lost faith in the media due to its tendency to shield corruption, overlook significant matters, and target those who dare to challenge it. Rather than engaging in self-reflection, why not consider the question? Why do people no longer believe us? You commit fully. You inform them of their lack of intelligence. You inform them that they're perilous for merely inquiring. His voice dropped, not from uncertainty, but from mastery. He remarked that it lacks the essence of true journalism. That's a form of persuasion. A wave of sound swept across the room. There were murmurs. Others gazed at their screens, acutely aware that their producers were already contemplating how to present this. Yet, just as they began to find their balance, Karoline intervened once more. Are you aware of what the most heartbreaking aspect is? She inquired, her tone sharp and incisive. This outcome was not inevitable. Once, the media held a sense of integrity, a time when the public placed their trust in it. What about now? You've made a mockery of your own craft, and the only one to hold accountable is you. Yet another moment of quiet. Suddenly, a voice, more urgent and piercing, shattered the silence. The last effort to reclaim authority was approaching. The media had invested years in shaping dialogues like this, managing narratives, guiding public discussions, and framing every response before it was even articulated. Not today. Karoline's words lingered, a declaration, a provocation, a reflection presented to those who had long shunned self-examination. For the first time since the press conference commenced, a silence enveloped the room as no one uttered a word right away. The typical barrage of questions, the frequent interruptions, the self-satisfied rebuttals were all absent. The reporters certainly had plenty to express. It was due to their awareness. As soon as they began to speak, they would validate her perspective. Trump approached the microphone, examining them with the confidence of someone who had already claimed victory. What is happening? No follow-ups? He inquired, a playful grin dancing at the edge of his lips. Seriously, you can't be out of questions this soon. Calm. Quietude. In a quiet corner of the room, a cameraman leaned in to share a hushed remark with his colleague. A producer's voice crackled in a reporter's earpiece, searching for a new direction. At last, a woman clad in a navy blazer, a seasoned journalist from a prominent network, shattered the stillness. Mr. Trump, she stated, her voice cutting and insistent. You have consistently asserted that the 2020 election lacked fairness. Are you informing your supporters that the sole condition for accepting the outcome of 2024 is your victory? They were returning to the source. Karoline had already unveiled their strategies, yet they were depleting their options. When faced with pressure, they resorted to their familiar strategies. Trump remained unfazed. Americans are entitled to a just electoral process. If we had a media that fulfilled its responsibilities, you would be directing that same inquiry towards Democrats who spent 4 years deeming 2016 as illegitimate. The woman began to speak up, but Trump continued without interruption. You have spent 4 years here labeling me as an illegitimate president. You promoted the Russia hoax. You published articles claiming I took the election. Hillary Clinton continues to assert that it was taken from her. He inclined his body ever so slightly. So, will you be inquiring with Joe Biden about his acceptance of the results? Is that question one-sided? The woman's lips parted, yet she lingered for just a moment. In that fleeting moment, the atmosphere thickened, palpable with the revelation. The burden of hypocrisy laid bare before all. Karoline completed the task with finality. The truth is, you don't want accountability, she remarked, her gaze sweeping across the room. You seek compliance. You seek something beyond fairness. You seek authority. When someone steps outside the boundaries you've set, you quickly deem them a threat. Another moment of silence, a weighty one. A man positioned toward the rear of the room cleared his throat, adjusting his posture in his chair. A soft whisper floated through the air. A phone buzzed softly. A producer, stationed in a control room, was swiftly editing clips and attempting to salvage the moment. Victory was not within their grasp. They were aware of it. And now everyone in the room was aware of it as well. Trump reclined away from the microphone, a sense of contentment washing over him. Regardless, he remarked, gesturing with a hand. I believe we've reached the conclusion of our discussion. Karoline cast a final look at the audience before she pivoted and gracefully descended from the podium. And just like that, the press conference concluded. As Trump and Karoline moved away from the podium, the atmosphere in the room lingered in a state of suspension. Journalists focused intently on their scribbled observations. The cameras continued to capture every moment. Yet, the typical frenzied scramble to voice last-minute inquiries never materialized. Certain individuals were already aware. This one was beyond redemption. The headlines were being crafted prior to the commencement of the press conference. However, the typical approach was no longer going to suffice. Those who were observing witnessed the unfolding event. A handful of reporters shared hushed conversations, while others busily scrolled through their devices, monitoring the deluge of reactions pouring onto social media. The response was precisely what they had dreaded. Clips surged in popularity, raw and unrefined, disseminating at a pace that was impossible to manage. Individuals were not holding out for the sanctioned stories. Their decisions were already set in stone. A throng had assembled outside the building. Enthusiastic supporters, glued to their phones during the press conference, stood by, brimming with anticipation. As Trump and Karoline stepped outside, the atmosphere erupted with applause, cheers, and shouts of their names. Karoline cast a sidelong look at Trump, who wore a broad grin. He shook his head, remarking that they certainly didn't anticipate that. Karoline released a slow breath. Absolutely not. She truly meant it. For the first time in ages, the media faced real-time accountability. Not in secrecy. Not lost in an article weeks down the line. Broadcasting in real time to a vast audience. And there was absolutely nothing they could do to prevent it. A journalist burst through the doors, hurrying to the sidewalk, microphone ready, with a camera crew following closely behind. She hailed from one of the prominent networks, and her demeanor was frantic, reminiscent of an individual tasked with rescuing a vessel in distress. "Excuse me, Miss Leavitt? Mr. Trump?" she exclaimed, hurrying forward. "Just a brief moment of your time." Trump hardly acknowledged her presence. "Thank you, but I'll pass." She refused to let it slip away. "Are you confident in all that you expressed today?" Karoline pivoted, meeting her gaze with unwavering intensity. "Identify a statement I made that was inaccurate." The journalist parted her lips, yet silence enveloped her. Due to her inability to do so, not immediately, not without distorting something into falsehood. Trump let out a laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "Do you see? That is the issue at hand. When faced with undeniable truths, they shift the dialogue instead of addressing the reality." The audience surged once more, overwhelming any feeble reply the reporter was on the verge of uttering. Karoline averted her gaze, striding towards the vehicles idling at the curb. The cacophony of the crowd intensified, arms extending, shouts merging into an unyielding surge of energy. In that instant, a revelation dawned upon her. It went beyond merely Trump. The focus extended beyond the election, the press, or any contrived indignation the media might conjure up the following day. It encompassed a grander vision. It centered on individuals, genuine individuals, who had endured years of being told their instincts were misguided, that questioning was forbidden, and that even speaking out would lead to being branded as something despicable. Yet that era had come to an end. She cast a final look over her shoulder at the reporters lingering by the doors, engaged in hushed conversations, already scheming their approach to manage the fallout. It was of no consequence. Today a change had occurred. The story was no longer in their hands. Ultimately, the truth has a way of revealing itself. Text regardless of the media's efforts to influence views, individuals remain perceptive. The truth is evident to them. The manipulation is evident to them. And when someone finally confronts it, they don't merely observe. Memories linger. Karoline and Trump entered that press conference ready for battle. The press entered, ready to triumph as they always did. Yet, when reality confronts falsehood, only one emerges more powerful. This time, it wasn't the press. If you value the importance of truth, consider sharing this video. Reveal the truth of what truly transpired.